Hello and welcome back to Volume 2 of Serial Killers. Today we'll be continuing with our biographies by looking into the life of Albert Fish, also known as the Bogeyman, the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Asteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, and finally, the Moon Maniac. He has a confirmed victim count of 3, but it could range from 15 or even higher, and he has claimed to have sexually abused over 100 children, one in each state, or at least one in each state. So let's begin. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870, to Randall Fish and Ellen Howell. And he was the youngest of 4 children with 3 siblings named Walter, Annie, and Edwin. Fish's family had a history of mental illness, including an uncle with mania and religious psychosis, and his mother suffered from hallucinations, both auditory and visual, or just one or the other. Plus, his brother was later confined in a state mental hospital, and his sister was diagnosed with a mental affliction. Along with 3 other relatives were also diagnosed with mental illness. So it's a lot of mental illness history. And of course, if you do know, if your family has a history of mental illness, you're more likely to also experience a mental illness from biological predispositions. But we will discuss more of that further. Fish's mother, Ellen Fish, was a Scots-Irish American, and his father, Randall Fish, was of English descent, and he worked as a riverboat captain, and by 1870, a fertilizer manufacturer. When he was 75 years old at the time of Albert's birth, and he suddenly died of a heart attack in 1875. So, most sources say this was around October 16th. This occurred when Albert was only 5 years old, or at this time Hamilton was only 5 years old, leaving Ellen Fish alone to take care of her 4 children. However, she was unable to support her family, and so Ellen put Hamilton into the care of St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. Most likely she specifically put Hamilton into an orphanage because he was the youngest, so it kind of made the most sense. The older kids could probably go and get jobs and help pay finances and that, because it was the late 1800s. That was a very common practice at the time. But Hamilton nonetheless did go into the care of St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C., where he would stay until he was about 9 years old, leaving in 1879. At the orphanage, Fish was frequently abused and beaten by the teachers or instructors, who were mostly nuns or sisters, because this was a religious orphanage. The children were often beaten in groups and forced to strip naked. Eventually, as this continued, Fish began to receive pleasure with the pain he received, as well as pleasure while watching the pain of the other children getting beaten with him, which became his first sexual kind of feeling or experience around the age of 7, when he got an erection during a beating, after which he was teased and humiliated for it. Albert Fish later said after his arrest, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." So, of course, this is an orphanage. Not only are the children being subjected to beatings by these instructors, but it would not surprise me that the fellow boys were also doing some questionable acts. Fish also witnessed other boys commit sexual sensory acts and begin to lie or beg and steal from his peers. So kind of being immersed in that type of petty crime at a relatively young age. So let's begin with the psychological profile. Fish's time in the orphanage served as the groundwork for the origins of most of Fish's significant motivations for his later killings, and were formative to Fish's mental disorders and criminal activities. Being subjected to physical and sexual abuse as a child, where being forced to witness the abuse of others was extremely mentally damaging for Fish. And for Fish, the trauma of the orphanage was internalized and then repeated throughout his life and in his crimes with his victims in sort of a ritualized fashion. The orphanage where Fish developed his sexual attraction to small children, particularly young boys, and it also created a link between sex and violence based on what Fish had witnessed, and in turn equal sexual gratification with inflicting pain or humiliation on others, as well as having pain and humiliation inflicted on himself, making his chief impulse for killing and engaging in these abnormal and unhealthy sexual fantasies and behaviors with his victims. So this is really kind of the formative years. Plus, combine that with his family history of mental illness. I'm not sure if you know about this, but there's this diathesis stress model where both biological factors and environmental factors combine together to make it more likely for someone to have mental illness, which is certainly the case with Albert Fish here. Fish's sexual desires would have been a paraphilic disorder, which is an extreme or abnormal sexual interest or desire that, when acted on, is harmful either to himself or others or both. You may remember covering paraphilias in the terminology video when we first started this series. Just as a friendly reminder, this would not be a fetish because a fetish is an inanimate object or body part. I found out that this is because the fetish actually comes from a Portuguese word, meaning a supernatural object that holds power over. And in case of a sexual fetish, it has sexual power over someone. So it kind of has to be an object, otherwise it's a paraphilia if it's just abnormal or in extreme. But anywho, Fish appears to have multiple paraphilic disorders, mainly sexual sadomasochism, or sexual sadomasochistic disorder, which is sexual gratification to pain on oneself or non-consenting others, usually both. Although it is important to note that sadomasochism isn't inherently a paraphilic disorder, but it is a bit of a slippery slope because there are certainly willing partners who will engage in this, and it can be perfectly healthy and normal, but sexual sadomasochism is a very deep and complex psychology. And we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about serial killers. So we're just getting a small hint of this. But I do want to note that sexual sadomasochism isn't inherently bad or a disorder if you can have it in a healthy kind of fashion. It's usually when they either do it to a non-consenting person or they're doing it so much to themselves that it's putting themselves in great risk or harm. Fish also had a pedophilia, which is sexual attraction to children. Also to note that there are actually healthy ways to have pedophilia. Most of the times when someone has pedophilia and processes it healthily, they'll like role play in a sexual context. But to be a paraphilic disorder in terms of pedophilia is usually when they do actually commit sexual acts with children. That's when it becomes a disorder. Not just having the attraction. That doesn't make it a disorder technically. Fish's time at the orphanage could have also been the origins of Fish's later religious delusions and hallucinations, because it is believed that Fish did have schizophrenia. Since Fish and the boys at the orphanage were abused by a nun and seen a religious authority figure do such brutal and sadistic things, could have been what ultimately made Fish believe these acts and his later crimes were sanctioned by God, and also gave the theme of religion to his later psychosis. This is what I believe to possibly be a picture of Albert Fish's father, Randall Fish. However, I couldn't find much information on these photos, so it could maybe be a completely different person. It could be Randall Fish. I just couldn't find much information, so keep in mind it may or may not be. Although I do have his gravestone with his year of death. This is also another image I found that I couldn't really confirm, and there wasn't much information on the source of this image, but I found it, so I thought I'd include it. But this is possibly either a young Albert Fish or one of his later victims, which we'll discuss later. However, I believe it's most likely Fish. If it's even, it could be neither. It could just be a completely random boy. Similar picture there. Same things apply. In 1879, Fish's mother secured a federal job and was able to bring her son back home from the orphanage. Around age 15, Fish changed his first name from Hamilton to Albert in order to rid himself of the nickname his peers had given him, Ham and Eggs, and got the name Albert from a younger sibling who had died as a baby. In 1882, when Fish was 12 years old, he met a telegraph boy, and the two began a sexual relationship, and Fish was introduced into practices such as drinking urine, eating feces, and voyeurism, watching others have sex. Not much is known about Fish in his teen years, along with most of his life, because this is the late 1800s, early 1900s. But Fish claimed to have worked as a prostitute to have sex with men for money. This continued into Fish's 20s, if it is true. However, it is unclear for how long this went on. Other sources do say that Fish only started to be a prostitute for men in his 20s and not his teens at all. Fish began visiting public baths and male brothels, where he would watch other boys undress and spend a great portion of his weekends and free time on these visits. It is believed around this time that Fish also began raping young boys around 1987. Around the age of 17, Fish began to work as a laborer, mostly as a house painter. And when Fish was 20 in 1898, he became a house painter full-time. In 1890, Fish moved from Washington, D.C. to New York City with his mother. And in 1898, Fish married his first wife, who was 19-year-old Anna Mary Hoffman. This marriage was arranged by Fish's mother, and this was when Fish was 28. They were married for the next 19 years. They had 6 children together: Albert Jr., Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. While working as a house parent to support his family, Fish traveled to different cities and states to find work, while his wife stayed home with their 6 children. Fish's occupation as a house painter moved him around a lot, and it seemed that the majority of his crimes took place while he was off at the job. He would rape and molest children, usually young boys, but also young girls under the age of 6 usually, in basements where they were staying or an abandoned place nearby. He had many of these locations. The exact extent of his sexual assaults and crimes as a house painter are largely unknown because, again, this is such an early time. This is before really any forensics, and serial murder, especially in this context, is very hard to really truly investigate, so we'll probably never know the full extent of Fish's crimes. But we can probably ascertain that because of all the freedom he has, because of the time period and the kind of poor investigation techniques at the time, that Fish probably has quite a victim count in terms of sexual assault and possibly even more murder victims. Again, if you remember at the beginning of the episode, he claimed up to over 100 and at least one in every state. And given the time period, that is actually completely plausible for all of his life, and just the conditions definitely makes it a very likely possibility he had quite the victim count, both murder and abuse. If something went wrong or anyone became suspicious of Fish, this is why being a house painter and doing it on the job is so smart at a strategic standpoint, because Fish could just easily pack up and move on to the next assignment or go back home for a new client. Plus, the fact that children were often ignored on claims of Fish's acts or not believed, or they never even told anyone, fearing the shame or consequences, or they were too young to even know what had happened to them, or that was wrong, because they didn't know what sex really was. So taking on the new identity of Albert from the younger sibling who died as a baby, provided Fish with an escape and freed him from the humiliating nickname, but also from the trauma he experienced up until that point. By taking a new name, particularly from a deceased younger brother, Fish experienced a sort of rebirth and new beginning, starting his life over from where his baby brother left off when he died. Hamilton was a victim, abused and bullied by others, and by giving up that name, Fish could dissociate that identity. And as Albert, he could define his own image and identity and take control of his life for the first time. This want to control his life would later influence Fish's crimes to take control over others as well, and not just about his paraphilic disorders and psychosis. So you mainly have three-pronged motives: sexual and lust, and then power and control, and then religious psychosis or visionary motives. Fish later recalled visiting a waxworks museum where he saw the bisection of a penis and became fascinated, or obsessed really, with sexual mutilation. In 1903, when Fish was 33, he was arrested for grand larceny and embezzlement and was sentenced to incarceration at Sing Sing prison. But the context of this arrest is unclear, but it is reported that Fish did engage with sex and sexual acts with the other male prisoners. And it's unclear for how long his sentence was, but it was at most until 1910, because that's when we have his next reported crime. Either in 1910 or 1911, when Fish was about 40 years old, he met a 19-year-old boy named Thomas Keaton. Other sources say it's Thomas Beaton. Also, race is unclear. Some claim African-American race, others white. But, of course, again, this time period, records were kind of poor. While working in Wilmington, Delaware, who looked young for his age, but was also most likely mentally handicapped. Fish took Keaton to an abandoned farmhouse where Fish tied him up and tortured him for about 2 weeks on end. Once Fish's painting job was over, he could no longer afford to keep Keaton as a prisoner, and so as a final sadistic act, Fish cut Keaton badly and attempted to dismember him by cutting off half or bisecting his penis. However, Fish stopped himself, appearing to have a change of heart after seeing Keaton's agonized expression on his face. So Fish cleansed the wounds as best he could by pouring peroxide over it, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered hand handkerchief, untied him, and left Keaton clothes and a $10 bill. He then kissed Keaton and then left. Fish had no idea what happened to Keaton afterwards, neither do we, and he didn't try to find out himself. Fish also later said that he originally intended to kill Keaton, cut up his body, and take it home, but he feared the hot weather would draw attention to him. He said, "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me. Took first train I could get back home. Never heard what become of him, or tried to find out." It's also possible that Fish attacked and mutilated a mentally retarded or handicapped boy in New York, possibly to death, in 1910 as well. Might be a second one. So some more psychology. Fish claimed to have not killed Keaton to avoid suspicion, but then why clean up Keaton's wound and leave him a $10 bill? This was possibly to avoid Keaton from going to the authorities, but another possibility is that despite Fish's desire to inflict pain, Fish felt like he had gone too far with Keaton, and seeing his expression could have triggered him to remember his time in the orphanage, making Fish capable of some small amount of empathy. So not entirely a psychopath. This is the mugshot from when Fish was arrested for grand larceny in 1903. This is possibly Thomas Beaton, and it is undetermined. However, given the fact that some say it was 19, or that he might have been African American or mentally handicapped, it does lead me to believe this is more likely Albert Fish. But at the same time, this exact sources, his race is undetermined or unconfirmed, I should say. And he did look young for his age, so who really knows? Or it could have been when he was younger. But if I had to put money on it, I'd probably go with Albert Fish. In 1917, when Fish was 47 years old, Anna, his wife, suddenly abandoned him and their 6 children after 19 years of marriage to run off with another man named John Stradube, I don't know, who was a handyman who had previously boarded with the Fish family. When she left, Anna took or sold every possession in their home, or as Fish claims, that's what happened, and left Fish and his children with nothing. Suddenly, Fish was a single parent and a sole provider for 6 children. It is unclear exactly why Anna suddenly left Fish after 19 years of marriage. There are possibilities and speculations, but we won't really know for sure. But what we do know is during the marriage, Fish did say he had Anna participate in sadomasochistic activities in their sex life. Anna possibly suspected or feared Fish of his other crimes, or just feared him for his sadomasochistic tendencies in general. But stayed with Fish for 19 years as Anna married Fish when she was 19. And so she had no other place to go. And Fish was her only form of support, so she stayed and went along with Fish's sexual behaviors until he found someone else he could support her, the handyman who she ran off with. After Anna left Fish, he began to experience hallucinations like hearing voices when Fish was 47 years old, and his behavior dramatically changed. So if he does have any type of schizophrenia or psychosis, it is fairly late onset. And if I remember correctly, I believe late onset schizophrenia does have a tendency to be more violent and aggressive in people who suffer from it. Because usually with schizophrenia, you start seeing it a little more in teens and adolescents and 20s, not in their late 40s. Most of Fish's delusions or hallucinations were of a religious nature, and we talked about why that might be from the orphanage, and said that he heard religious figures telling him what to do. For example, in one instance, Fish wrapped himself in a carpet and spent the entire night sleeping on the floor, saying that he was following the instruction of John the Apostle. Another instance was reported by Fish's son, Albert Fish Jr., who recalled one of Fish's episodes saying, quote, "It was 1922. My brothers Henry, Jean, and I were playing football when we saw our father standing on a hill not too far from us. His hand was raised and he was yelling something over and over. He was yelling, 'I am Christ.'" Albert Fish Jr. also remembered Fish trying to catch and kill a black cat he found in the basement. After building a trap to catch this cat, Fish brought Albert Jr. in the basement to help him. However, Fish ran through the basement trying to catch the cat by hand, but Albert Jr. never saw a cat. Around this time, Fish also began to indulge in self-harm and frequently engaged in self-flagellation, typically while masturbating, and was witnessed beating himself with a nail-studded paddle while pleasuring himself. It is possible, in fact, highly likely, that Fish indulged in these self-flagellation and self-harm practices before, but after the possible stressor of his wife leaving him suddenly and leaving him alone with 4 children and selling everything he had, that it might have increased kind of abruptly along with his psychosis. Fish also frequently stuck himself with needles in and around his abdomen, genitals, pelvic region, sometimes sticking them in so far that Fish couldn't retrieve them. Another thing Fish would do was to insert wool soaked with lighter fluid into his anus and set it on fire. Fish even had his children and their friends participate in his masochistic activities, like encouraging them and their friends to paddle his buttocks with the same nail-studded paddle he used to abuse himself, but Fish was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his own children. In 1919, when Fish was 49 years old, he stabbed, or it is reported he stabbed, an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Fish remarried 3 times after Anna left, but because Fish and Anna never officially divorced, all the other marriages were illegal. One of Fish's other wives was Estella Wilcock, and they married on February 26, 1924, in Waterloo, New York, but since the marriage was not legitimate, it ended 1 week later. Fish's delusions or hallucinations. To clarify, hallucinations are when you're seeing or hearing things that aren't there, and delusions are irrational beliefs that, despite evidence to the contrary, you believe are true, which can include hallucinations, but also just strange, warped views. But anyway, back to Fish's delusions. He began to believe that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children as sacrifices to atone for his sins. On July 11th, 1924, Fish, now 54 years old, found 8-year-old Beatrice Kiley playing alone on her parents' Staten Island farm and offered her money to come and help him look for a rhubarb, which is, if you don't know, a type of plant that you eat. Beatrice was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Fish away, and Fish left but returned later to the Kiley's farm or barn, where he tried to sleep but was discovered by the father, Hans Kelly, and forced to leave. Fish would also frequent the classified ads section of newspapers and found ads placed by women and would then send these women very obscene, which is very outrageous and often sexual nature, inappropriate, letters using a fake identity and usually posed as a movie producer, and would ask the woman he was writing to if she would help him take care of his son, who was in need of discipline and was looking for someone who wouldn't be afraid to spank his son or punish him in other more violent ways. Fish sent letters like this throughout his life. Anna leaving Fish and Fish becoming a single father would have been a major stressor for Fish, which likely negatively affected his mental health, leading to Fish escalating his behaviors and triggering his hallucinations or delusions or whatever psychosis he was suffering from. Fish could be on the schizophrenic spectrum, which of course is a psychotic disorder. By the way, psychotic does not necessarily mean crazy or is a psychopath. Psychotic is just where you're suffering from breaks from reality. It's a pet peeve of mine when people use psychotic to describe serial killers when they are not suffering from breaks from reality. It's just a pet peeve of mine, and I want to enlighten you. It is defined by abnormal thoughts of behavior that lead an individual to break with reality. There's often disorganized speech or thought. Fish definitely seem to have some disorganized thoughts. With hallucinations or delusions, specifically for Fish, of a religious nature. The religious hallucinations could have a connection to the nuns in the orphanage from Fish's childhood, as we've discussed previously. The schizophrenia, along with all of Fish's other behaviors of writing obscene letters and self-harm, were outlets for Fish's sadomasochistic fantasies, and also as a way to take control. In the letters, the false identity was also a way of exerting control over people because he's tricking them with a false identity. And he's also causing harm to people who he sends letters to by writing these obscenities. This is kind of an example of the nail-studded paddle Fish would have used. I'm not sure if it's an exact drawing of one Fish did use, but it kind of helps paint a picture. Wait, hold on. I want to see if I have my dates right. 11th. Okay. On July 14th, 1924, in Staten Island, on a hot summer day, in a Port Richmond neighborhood, which is a relatively poor neighborhood, I think it might actually be borderline slum area. If it isn't a slum, I'm not entirely sure about the Port Richmond neighborhood. But anywho, 8-year-old Francis the X for the middle initial, I'm not entirely sure what it stands for, but Francis X. McDonald was playing alone when his mother, Anna McDonald, went to check on him. Surveying the neighborhood, Anna saw an elderly man shuffling down the street, staring at her son Francis. When the man noticed Anna was watching, he tipped his hat to her and walked away. Of course, this man was Albert Fish. Hours later, Anna McDonald was inside her family apartment tending to her infant daughter as Francis again went to play in the street with his friends and little brother. However, Fish had returned and Anna didn't notice him. According to Francis's friends, they saw Fish beckon Francis over to him while the children continued to play. When the kids looked back over, Francis and Fish were gone, and when Francis didn't come home for dinner, his brother told his parents about the old man he saw. Francis's father was a Staten Island cop and formed a search party and scoured the entire neighborhood looking for Francis, until Francis's body was found in the local woods, concealed under branches and leaves. There's evidence of Francis being sexually assaulted, with his clothes torn from his body, and he was strangled with his own suspenders. He also had lacerations on his legs and abdomen, which were almost entirely stripped of flesh. And of course, here is a picture of Francis McDonald. An autopsy revealed undigested raisins in Francis's stomach, leading detectives to believe that the kidnapper used these as a treat to gain Francis's trust and lure him away from his friends and into the woods. But beyond that, police had no leads or clues about who committed the crime. Anna McDonald described the old man she witnessed, saying, quote, "He came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself, making queer motions with his hands. I'll never forget those hands. I shuddered when I looked at them. How they opened and shut, opened and shut, opened and shut. I saw him look towards Francis and the others. I saw his thick gray hair, his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray. The gray man turned to me and tipped his cap, and then he went on his way. When Fish was later arrested, he said he planned to dismember the body, and again, kind of like what he's saying with Keen, he wanted to dismember the body and take the body meat home, but he thought he heard someone approach in the woods, so he did his best to cover the body and fled, so he didn't have time to do whatever extra sadomasochistic things. And as we'll discuss later, with his second confirmed victim of cannibalism and other mutilation. However, there wasn't a lot of signs of torturing compared to his next victim, which we're about to discuss. So we have a lot of psychology, however, to unpack with Fish's traditional MO. This is the first real good example of Fish's MO, however, looking back at the attempted abduction of Beatrice, Kylie, or whatever last name is pronounced, and the torture of Thomas Keaton, we can really kind of see similarities of Fish's MO, which he's most likely been doing for years before Francis McDonald's murder. But, however, due to, again, the time period, lack of records, not necessarily the best police investigative techniques, it is most likely he was repeating this MO throughout his early life from when he was in his 20s as a house painter. Because, although this is Fish's first reported victim, it is highly, highly likely he had murder victims beforehand, and a lot more than the 3 we're going to discuss. Anywho, Fish's MO traditionally consisted of targeting children from low-income areas like Port Richmond. Later explained that he preferred these kinds of neighborhoods, particularly ones with prominently black populations, because in those neighborhoods, if a child went missing, it was likely to go unreported in the news or less effort put into by the police investigation due to their class or race. It is possible this is why most of Fish's victims are unknown, again, given the time period as well. However, in Francis's case, due to the fact that Francis's father was a cop, he had more resources to make an effort into investigating his son's murder, such as his corpse being found so quickly. Fish also gave his victims treats like candy or raisins, as with Francis, to get them to trust him and leave with him, sometimes even using money in poor neighborhoods as a greater incentive, because in this time period with poor neighborhoods, children often did have to work for money, and money for their family was a great help to pay for rent or food or necessities. Fish was also an opportunistic with his crimes, only taking children that were unsupervised by adults. Fish also used the persona of a harmless elderly man. I believe he's in his 50s at this time in 1924. To his advantage in hindering his darker desires or intentions. Of course, this is now before when he was younger. He was also probably committing these same acts and didn't have that advantage. But now he's really using this elderly persona. Fish's life between 1924 and 1927 is largely unknown. Excuse me, I might have these dates wrong. I will be back in just a minute. Apologize for this brief interruption, but I may have mistyped a date in here. Okay, no, never mind. Great. So, okay. As I was saying, Fish's life between 1924 and 1927 is largely unknown, for, again, all the reasons I have previously discussed. On February 11th, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was playing in the hallway of the small tenement where his family lived in Brooklyn with his friend and neighbor, 3-year-old Billy Beaton. Billy and Billy. When Beaton's father came to check on the boys, he saw that they were gone, and Mr. Beaton rushed around the building looking for the 2 boys and eventually found his son, Billy Beaton, on the roof of the building, but Billy Gaffney was not with him. When Billy Beaton was asked by his father what had happened to Billy Gaffney, he said the Bogeyman took him. But of course, that claim was dismissed, as he is a child. Fish had a painting job nearby at the time, and like with Francis McDonald, Billy was from a poor neighborhood, and he was left unsupervised, so Fish lured the 2 boys away with treats. At first, Fish took both boys, but ended up leaving Billy Beaton behind on the roof, possibly because Fish believed that more could go wrong with taking 2 children. The only solid witness the police had was a trolley car conductor who said to have seen an elderly man with a young boy aboard the trolley around the time Billy went missing, and said that the young boy cried the entire time. The conductor's story was confirmed by the motorman of the trolley. Yet even with these witnesses, the investigation into Billy's disappearance went nowhere, and Billy's body was never recovered. Instead of taking Billy to a nearby place like Fish had normally done or had done with Francis McDonald, by the way, Fish is now 56 years old, Fish took Billy from Brooklyn to a garbage dump in Astoria, Queens. later saying that he knew about the dump because it was close to a house Fish had previously painted. It's possible and likely that Fish had secluded places marked in his mind all over the city that he found on his painting jobs to take victims and not risk getting caught. It's also possible that Billy wasn't the first child Fish took to that particular dump. However, we just simply don't know. Once Fish and Billy got to the dump, Fish stripped Billy naked, tied him up, and grabbed him. Fish then left Billy at the dump overnight and returned the next day about 12 hours later with tools and weapons to torture Billy, including a nail-studded paddle, knife, and a belt. Fish then began to torture Billy to death. After Billy was dead, Fish dismembered the body, putting most of it into a sack, which he weighed down with stones and threw into the water. Fish took the rest home, prepared the different body parts in various ways, and made a meal out of the body by either roasting some of the body parts and putting others into a stew for the next 4 days. Fish would draw out the experience by eating the meat over several days, during which he would masturbate constantly. Around late 1927 and early 1928, Fish attempted to abduct and possibly kill, rape, torture, and mutilate and cannibalize a boy named Cyril Quinn and his friend who is unknown. It is thought that Fish may have been molesting Quinn previously, but it is relatively unconfirmed. Quinn and his friend were playing box ball on the sidewalk when Fish asked them if they had eaten lunch. The boys said no, and so Fish invited them into his apartment for sandwiches. While the two boys were wrestling on Fish's bed, they dislodged his mattress, and underneath was a knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver, which caused the boys to become frightened and ran out of the apartment. The knife, handsaw, and meat cleaver were his traditional tools to torture his victims, which he referred to as his implements of hell. So, got some more psychology, especially now with this first instance of cannibalism. Instead of taking Billy to a local place to kill him, Fish wanted to go somewhere there was no chance of Fish being discovered, like with his murder of Francis McDonald. When he had to forego dismembering Francis's body, fearing someone was approaching. But a dump was isolated, and Fish could torture Billy to satisfy his sadistic fantasies. As far to what is known, Billy was the first victim Fish cannibalized, but based on Fish's later confession of how vividly and elaborate he described which body parts he liked to eat and how he cooked the body parts, suggests that Fish had cannibalized before. Also, we can see instances of when mutilating Francis McDonald but being prevented. It is also possible he wanted to take the meat home to cannibalize. And the same thing when wanting to mutilate Thomas Beaton but then changed his mind. Considering that Fish planned to dismember Francis McDonald also suggests that Fish planned to cannibalize Francis as well. As to why Fish committed criminal cannibalism, of course, cannibalism in some cultures is a completely normal practice. And cannibalism, of course, in the United States is in itself illegal. There are some health risks, but there's auto-cannibalism, which is technically legal, but also some health risks. But really, in terms of cannibalism, the psychology and reasons why are vastly different from Fish than, say, indigenous tribes in Papua New Guinea. So really, we want to talk about criminal cannibalism in terms of psychology. One theory is that being abandoned in childhood to go to the orphanage could have made Fish want to consume another person as a way to fulfill the void caused by the separation or abandonment he felt from being sent to the orphanage. By consuming a person, Fish could make sure that that person would never leave him. It's also possible that his cannibalism escalated or started after Fish's first wife, Anna, left him, and before that he only fantasized about cannibalism until his wife's abandonment re-triggered the trauma of abandonment from childhood, causing Fish to act on his cannibalistic fantasies. Of course, this is speculation, but it is likely that the abandonment of his wife was definitely a stressor, so makes sense with escalation of some behaviors. However, there are instances that Fish may have wanted to commit cannibalism before his wife left him, again with Thomas Keaton. Another theory to Fish's cannibalism is that it was connected to his sexual sadomasochistic fantasies by making the cannibalism sexual. Plus, for sexual sadists like Fish, cannibalism is the ultimate show of dominance, power, and control over another person. And to consume another person is to exert total power over them, because now they will possess them forever. Plus, considering that Fish masturbated constantly when eating Billy Gaffney's body suggests a lot more of this. Also, considering with the feeling the void of abandonment, you also kind of see this similar fear of rejection and possession with certain necrophiles, which Fish was. I'm not entirely sure. I think Fish might have actually been a necrophile with his final confirmed victim and most famous victim. But anywho, it could be either or, it could be both, it could be neither. These are just, it's psychology, it's a soft science. We're just speculating with what we got. It could be right, it could be wrong, who knows. Anywho, combined with the theory of abandonment causing Fish's cannibalism, consuming his victims could have made Fish feel he was exerting total control and power over his victims, and their bodies were forced to stay with him. Fish's schizophrenia also played into his cannibalism. In fact, many cannibals are diagnosed with schizophrenia or some other psychotic disorder. And for Fish, his schizophrenia of religious delusions of killing to make sacrifices to God, Fish saw his cannibalism as the same as sacrament of Holy Communion. For Fish, the act of killing and eating a child was comparable to that of taking part in a symbolic religious rite to spiritually connect with someone with Christ. So you can really get a sense of how delirious he was. Here's another photo of Billy Gaffney. This one's kind of blurry, so I have a smaller one sized down so you can kind of see it more clearly than its larged up version. Here's a bit more larger and detailed portraiture. One year after Billy Gaffney's abduction and murder, Fish, now 58 years old, saw a classified ad that appeared in the morning edition of the New York World newspaper on Sunday, May 27th, 1928, which read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." Edward Budd was looking for a job to help support his family. His parents were Delia Flanagan and Albert Budd. He had two sisters, Beatrice and Grace Budd, three brothers, Edward, George, and Albert Budd Jr. A lot of Alberts going on, like Albert Fish Jr., Albert Budd Jr. Anywho, who were desperately poor, like on the edge of destitution and in desperate need of money for necessities. The day after the ad ran in the paper on May 28th, 1928, Fish showed up at the Budd apartment dressed in a three-piece navy suit and a black felt hat, and he introduced himself as Frank Howard. He said he owned a successful farm in Farmingdale, Long Island, and saw Edward's ad, and he was interested in hiring Edward as his farmhand for $15 a week, which in 1928 to a family in near destitution and in lower working class, poor, etc., was a lot of money for a family in poverty in this time. Fish, posing as Frank Howard, was introduced to Edward Budd, as well as Edward's friend Willie Corman, who were both built, strong young men, both 18 years old. Fish ended up offering both boys a job as farmhands, which the boys excitedly and graciously accepted. Fish returned the next Sunday on June 3rd, 1928, to take Edward and Willie to the fictional farm, but Fish arrived early and Edward and Willie weren't home at the time. The Budds invited Mr. Howard to have lunch with them while they waited for the boys to return, and Fish then met the Budds' other child, 12-year-old Grace Budd, who was still wearing her church clothes in a white confirmation dress. And Fish was immediately entranced by Grace, and Fish invited Grace to come over and sit on his lap. Kind of a strange request, but there you go. Edward and Willie returned to the apartment, but Fish told them that he wasn't going to take them to the farm just yet, saying his sister was having a birthday party for one of her children nearby, and he needed to go to the party before they left for the farm in Long Island. Fish then offered to take Grace with him to the birthday party, and he would be sure to have Grace home by 9 that night, causing Mr. and Mrs. Budd to have a dilemma. On one hand, they didn't want to offend Mr. Howard, who has done so much for them, but they didn't want to send their daughter off with someone they just met and barely knew. After a moment's hesitation and a bad judgment call, the Budds agreed to let Grace go with Mr. Howard to the party, thinking Mr. Howard seemed harmless enough. Plus, they're doing so much, providing their son and his friend with such a well-providing job. But as the saying goes, if it's too good to be true. And yeah, bad judgment call. After Fish and Grace left the apartment for the party, Fish picked up the tools he had intended to use to kill Grace at a newsstand where he dropped off the tools at earlier on his way to the Budd apartment, which were a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw, which again he called his implements of hell, which were wrapped in a bundle of cloth so no one would see Fish walking around with various weapons and sharp objects. Once Fish and Grace retrieved the bundle of weapons, the two rode several trains to Westchester, New York. When Fish and Grace were getting off the train at the final stop, Fish almost forgot the bundle of weapons on the train, but Grace reminded Fish about the bundle and even went back to retrieve it for him. Fish led Grace to Wisteria Cottage, which was an abandoned house set back near some woods that Fish used to live in with his family in Westchester, New York. Grace began picking flowers in the yard while Fish went upstairs in the cottage to lay out his tools in one of the rooms and he took off all of his clothes in order not to get blood on them. Fish then went to the window and called Grace upstairs, where Fish first strangled Grace to death. Then once Grace was dead, he dismembered her body and took the preferred body parts home with him to cook and eat over the next 9 days. When Frank Howard and Grace didn't return home that night, Mr. and Mrs. Budd began to worry, but waited until the morning to call the police, and an investigation into the disappearance of Grace Budd began. As to why Mr. and Mrs. Budd waited until morning to call the police is unknown. Possibly they just had a hard time realizing they had misplaced their trust in this Frank Howard, but who knows. So Fish's plan was quickly devised in order to get his next victim after seeing the ad Edward Budd placed in the newspaper. Fish's original plan was to kill Edward Budd after luring him to Wisteria Cottage, but when Fish met Edward Budd, Fish was disappointed by how mature and strong Edward looked. If you remember, of course, Fish is a pedophilic disorder, so he likes the younger boys. Plus, considering how strong Edward looked, it's very possible that things could go wrong. And he was even further disappointed when he was introduced to Willie and had doubts about his ability to overpower Edward and Willie, as, again, he was in his 50s. He's not necessarily the athletically spry at this point in his life. However, Fish's compulsion to kill was too strong to stop Fish, so he planned to overpower the boys by taking them by surprise and subdue them despite their size, so Fish continued with his plan until he met Grace, but instead. Grace was closer to age with Fish's preferred victim, but not the preferred gender, since Fish preferred boys. Yet it is known that, or highly, it is known actually that Fish also raped young girls. It is unclear if he killed any young girls, however, it is likely and suspected. So Fish changed his story of the party to lure away the new, more suiting victim that was easier to subdue and more closer to his preferred victim type. It is also possible that due to Fish's religious delusions and schizophrenia, that when he saw Grace in her Sunday confirmation dress, it played with his hallucinations of killing as a sacrifice to God. Unlike Fish's previous MO of abducting children from a poor neighborhood who were unsupervised by adults and then luring them away, Fish assumed a fake identity and told an elaborate story to lure away his victim, as well as interacting with the family of the victim directly, which ensured that there would be witnesses. This is a very clear escalation for Fish, possibly triggered due to the fact Fish is suspected of sexually assaulting children in his traditional MO since 1887. That's 4 decades by this point. And found that this tactic wasn't thrilling enough or wasn't satisfying enough for him anymore. And so he changed his MO in order to make his criminal actions exciting again. This is common with most serial killers. To the Butt family. Mr. Howard was a miracle, a well-off, successful man who had come to save them from poverty by offering their son a job that would provide for the entire family, causing the Butts to trust Mr. Howard immediately, even seeing him as an authority figure, with his success making him superior to the Butts, who could barely afford rent. And Fish enjoyed exerting that type of power and control over the Butts, and even used that as leverage to take Grace. By coming up with this fabricated story of Mr. Howard, the farm and the birthday party, Fish had a new way to exert power over others by tricking not just his victims, but also the victims' parents and family, with the purpose to assert dominance with superior intelligence by outsmarting them. By lying, Fish was able to control the way his victims and their families saw him and control the narrative of the situation, basically controlling people's perception of reality, and was close to the most power. Fish could hold on someone. I mean, if you're controlling how someone views you or yourself or the world, to the point you're letting your daughter go with a basic complete stranger, that's a lot of power. This method allowed Fish to hold all the power in the situation and put himself in control of the entire process by luring away a victim instead of waiting or hoping for a child to become unattended by an adult, and was now active in creating his own opportunity to pursue his target and not at the mercy of chance. By fully planning out the crime from the day it would happen, the tools he would use, of course, he dropped off his tools at a newspaper stand when he was originally planning to kill Edward and Willie, and then that's planning. And where he would take the victim. It's apparent that for Fish, killing a little girl, hold on. But you can see that all this elaborate planning, he's also exerting more control, not over other people, but of the world itself. He's taking control of his life a lot more in his crimes, and not just being opportunistic. It's apparent that for Fish, killing a little girl like Grace was different to Fish than killing a little boy like Billy Gaffney when comparing the two crimes. Even though Fish sexually assaulted and abused both boys and girls, he did prefer boys, seeing how most of Fish's known victims are boys, and comparing how Fish treated Grace Budd versus Billy Gaffney and Francis McDonald. Of course, remember, in the orphanage, Fish was around young boys, which is where he got his homosexual pedophilia. And that's why I mainly targeted boys. Billy Gaffney was tied up and tortured before Fish killed him, but Fish didn't sexually assault or torture Grace before killing her, and instead immediately strangled her. In Fish's mind, if he didn't violate Grace because he didn't sexually abuse her, but still had the motive to satisfy his sexual desires by killing and cannibalizing her. In fact, he would later be so adamant about the fact he didn't violate Grace, like excessively pointed out in his confession, in just so that's kind of hinting as it wasn't the same for him. He felt so adamant to make it a clear point that he did not assault Grace in a sexual context. So here's Grace and her family. This is Grace here. This is her sister, I think older sister, and this is her brother. That's the mom, that's her sister again. And then there's the brother again. There's Grace right here. Here is after Grace's disappearance, kind of an information poster. Height 4 feet. Last seen wearing felt hat, blue streamer and black. Hair dark, straight, bobbed, eyes blue, complexion shallow, physical condition anemic. That's a strange physical condition. I don't know, it's kind of weird to put. Last seen wearing pink rose hair, something. Last seen wearing gray overcoat with blue fur collar and cuffs and down front of coat. Last seen carrying brown pocketbook. Last seen wearing white silk dress. Last seen wearing white silk socks. Last seen wearing white shoes. Age 10 years. Weight 60 pounds. So this is her mother Delia posing for what I believe is a newspaper, the press, about the disappearance of her daughter, holding a portrait of Grace. And this is the mother Delia, and this is the father Albert Budd. Though sometimes it was clear that Delia was kind of getting a lot of attention and taking advantage of the attention Grace's disappearance got from her daughter's disappearance. Not to say she didn't care for her daughter at all, but she probably also did enjoy the attention and probably got money for the disappearance of her daughter, so that kind of helped her. This is the cottage Fish took Grace to, Wisteria Cottage. It's old, abandoned. Here is it today, kind of refurbished and all. You can see there's a bit remodeling going on there. This is kind of one side, and this is a different side of it. You can kind of see where it connects, and you can see that lower level is kind of new and refurbished. Okay. After Fish killed Grace Budd, there was a noticeable uptick in Fish's criminal behaviors, and over the summer of 1928, Fish was arrested 3 times on larceny charges in a 6-week period, but released each time. 2 years later, in November 1930, Fish, now 60 years old, was arrested for sending one of his obscene letters through the mail, which, according to the indictment, the letter was, quote, of such vile, obscene, and filthy nature that to set forth the contents of this thereof would defile the records of the court. In the letter, Fish once again graphically proposed to a woman to discipline his misbehaving son, and due to the letter's disturbing content, Fish was sent to Bellevue Hospital for observation. At Bellevue Hospital, Fish was examined by psychiatrists, and the official report the hospital gave the court described Fish as being quiet, cooperative, acted normal, and there was no evidence of delusional notions or hallucinatory experiences. Plus, his memory was particularly excellent for his old age, so the report concluded that Fish was a sexual pervert, but not insane, and also attributed the letter to an early stage of dementia in Fish due to his elderly senile age. Fish didn't like being at the hospital and being kept there by doctors and unable to leave by his own choice, so he's losing all the power he's gotten from his crimes and he's kind of feeling like he's back at the orphanage. He has no power. Even though he likes being humiliated, he doesn't like losing power. And he wrote to his daughter from Bellevue, "Now, Annie, do this for your poor old father. Write a letter to Dr. Gregory at Bellevue Hospital as soon as you get this. Ask him in God's name to send me back to court. You know, the sooner I get my sentence, the sooner I am back home." Fish was released from Bellevue in January 1931, and Fish continued to send more obscene letters and was arrested again and committed to another mental hospital for observation in August of 1931, but was only at the hospital for 10 days before he was released after the official report again described Fish as quiet, cooperative, and oriented. During these years, when Fish wasn't in the hospital, he later confessed to going to revisit Wisteria Cottage and the scene where he had killed Grace, but eventually stopped doing this. After Fish's time in the hospital, he stayed out of trouble for the next few years. And according to his son, Albert Fish Jr., who he was living with at the time, of course, now he's kind of all grown up and whatnot, Fish seemed normal after he got out of the second hospital. So Fish's stay at Bellevue is an excellent example of his ability to hide behind his appearance of an old man, and was aware that the only thing the doctors knew about him was from the letter, and had no way of knowing the full extent of his crimes or his delusions. Although it's kind of interesting that he is such a methodical thing, yet he has psychosis, possibly schizophrenia. But mental illness is weird. Where was I? Fish knew when he was asked by doctors to answer in a way that wouldn't raise further suspicion and avoided incriminating himself. Fish used this persona to lure his victims in for years, even decades, so he's kind of had time perfecting this. But at the hospital, Fish found himself in a situation where he was in an institution under total control of others, much like where he was in an orphanage as a boy with no control over his own life. That's kind of why he's committing, that's one of the reasons he's committing these crimes, to get control. So he's not liking that. Despite after decades of being so cautious to avoid attention, at 60 years old now, his numerous undiagnosed and untreated psychological disorders were most likely getting worse as his mental state deeply deteriorated from his age, causing Fish's uptick in criminal behavior. Another factor does appear to be Grace Budd's murder, which for Fish was a whole new experience, and was likely feeling a high point for his crimes and for the satisfaction from them. After tricking the entire Budd family to allowing him to take their daughter with their permission, executing his plan perfectly, and then getting away with the murder, Fish was likely feeling invincible, even though he was caught and arrested for other crimes. Plus, being released only bolstered his confidence further, contributing to his criminal uptick. But the sense of superiority wore off after the second hospital stay, when he was no longer in control and returned to acting normal in public. So kind of that I'm invincible over confidence, over eagerness, except with lesser petty crimes. Because sending letters have the same effect as killing, is that sadism of inflicting this kind of pain and confusion by these letters. However, Fish's strange escalation in his behavior continued in private, and in June 1934, Fish began to crave raw meat. and would insist that Albert Fish Jr. eat his meat raw as well, and would have terrible nightmares where he would scream, "Bud, Bud," in his sleep until Albert Jr. had to shake him awake with no idea of the significance of that word until Fish's arrest. Albert Fish Jr. also found his father's strange collection of newspaper clippings, a stash of needles, and even witnessed his father beating himself with a nail-studded paddle while masturbating. Meanwhile, during the 6 years since Grace Budd's disappearance, Detective William F. King had kept the investigation to find Grace's abductor alive and prevalent to the Missing Persons Division of the NYPD, acting as the chief investigator. And for 6 years, he determinedly continued hunted down every single lead that turned up. But all leads were a dead end with no success, but King still kept investigating. The police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope on September 5, 1930 as a suspect, accused by Pope's estranged wife, and spent 108 days in jail between his arrest and trial on December 22, 1930, where he was found not guilty and released. Detective King would often plant fake news stories about the progress in the investigation in the newspaper in order to try and scare up some new leads. And then on November 2nd, 1934, King planted a fake bit of news in New York City's most popular gossip column, at the time called On Broadway by Walter Mitchell, which read, quote, "I checked on the Grace Budd mystery, and it's safe to tell you that the Department of Missing Persons will break the case, or they expect to, in 4 weeks." Fish claimed to never have read the gossip column with the article, but it's highly likely that Fish actually did see it, considering what he did next. On November 12, 1934, 10 days after the column ran in the paper, Grace's mother, Delia Budd, received a letter in the mail. Delia was illiterate, and so Edward Budd read the letter for her. After reading the letter, Edward Budd took it straight to Detective King, who matched the handwriting to a telegram Mr. Frank Howard had sent to the Budds, and knew that the letter had come from Grace's killer. So, some more psychology. Fish was previously engaged in these strange behaviors in secret of his self-harm and all that before, and while his son was living with him, but Fish lost any attempt to hide these acts due to the reasons previously discussed, losing touch with reality, and more likely experiencing episodes of psychotic breaks due to his schizophrenia, which was worsening with his advancing age, and still feeling some sense of superiority and visibility in his own house, causing Fish's compulsions, desires, and true nature to slowly expose itself. Fish also had Albert Fish Jr. eat raw meat as a way to enact control. And also, the eat raw meat was probably part of his cannibalistic fantasies. So the letter that Fish sent, warning this has some graphic language and some mature language, mostly at the end. Sorry about that. That was a notification. Okay, the letter. Dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At the time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $2 to $3 per pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all the children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the streets. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. A part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and just what you and just what you want cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John sailed, kind of, or staled, I don't know, it's kind of an incorrect spelling. There so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to NY, he stole two boys, one 7 and one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and, of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, near Right Side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, and I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you a pot of cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry, and I turned to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and said she would tell her mama. And she said she would tell her mama, excuse me. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have had I wished. She died a virgin. So, you can see in his other obscene letters his desire to inflict the pain by all these graphic details to his mother to inflict pain on her. You can see his mad sadistic fantasies. Anywho, the story concerning Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong could not be verified, but the part of the letter concerning the murder of Grace Budd was found to be accurate in its description of the kidnapping and subsequent events, although it was impossible to confirm whether or not Fish had actually eaten parts of Grace's body. Although it's mainly suspected yes. The envelope of the letter was sent in a piece of stationery paper from the local NYPCBA, or New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, whereupon Detective King visiting found a janitor who told the police he had taken some of the stationery paper home, but left it in his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. Oh, the days when they had stationery paper and you would write a letter and just, the 20s or 30s at this point. Detective King then went to the address, and the laundry lady of the rooming house said that Fish checked out of that room a few days earlier, and also said that Fish's son sent him money, and he asked her to hold his next check for him. Detective King waited outside the room until Fish returned for the money, When Fish arrived, Detective King arrested Fish, and Fish agreed to go to the headquarters for questioning, but then brandished a razor knife. King disarmed Fish and took him to police headquarters. Fish confessed to writing the letter and killing Grace Budd, and even led police to Wisteria Cottage to show investigators where they were likely to find Grace's remains, but confessed to nothing else. When Fish confessed, he admittedly stated that he didn't rape or sexually abuse Grace several times, but he later claimed to his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. Oops, I repeated that. So here is police searching Wisteria Cottage for the remains of Grace Budd. There's some, I believe the one standing with a flashlight is a medical examiner. If you'll just give me a moment, I can pull up the details. So it's also reported that more than 50 fingers, legs, and other bones were found near the house where Albert Fish murdered Grace Budd. I haven't been able to find much other information claiming that, but it could tell that there's either, I'm not entirely sure if these are animal bones, this is just false information and over-exaggeration, or if Fish actually murdered there previously. It's hard to say. Let me see. Then this picture here, William Roth of the medical examiner's staff watches as another man digs in the cellar of the murder house. Previously, a human rib was found by police searchers. A saw was found around the crime scene. Fish was dubbed the Gray Man. Blah, blah, blah. 5 bones were taken from the well on the grounds of the house where Albert Fish killed Grace Budd. To be sure, they'd collected everything, and the well was pumped dry. Of course, these 50 bones, fingers, legs, etc., could also just be 50 bones, and as there's so many bones in the human body, it could just all be of Grace Budd scattered all about. It's hard to be sure. Medical examiner Dr. Amos O. Squire holds bones of the slain Grace Budd after the ghastly relics were dug up by cops in an abandoned house in Westchester Hills. Investigators check over a doll's wigs, women's shoes, and a man's suit and ties found near the deserted Westchester home where Albert Fish murdered Grace Budd. The house that became a crime scene for the murdered Grace Budd was called Wisteria Cottage. Just reading the captions of all these photos. Police inspect a shed that stands in back of the house in Westchester County after Albert Fish confessed in homicide court. The scene of the crime was believed to have been in the rear bedroom in a deserted home in Westchester County. Fish allegedly choked the girl and dismembered her. Here, Police Chief McCullen and District Attorney Connolly examined the room. Officers William Moore and John Harabmel hold fragments they believe to be human bones, which they dug up in the cellar of Fish's house. Sergeant Jerome Hogan of the Greenburgh, NY Police searched the crime scene. Hogan looks at a cleaver found in Fish's house that is believed to have been used to butcher Grace Budd. And that's just a kind of aerial shot. A search team combs the grounds of the crime scene where Grace Budd was murdered. And this, I just believe, is bone fragments and stuff were found here in this photo. Some more searching, probably the same things, bone fragments and the like. Okay, so psychology. It's likely that Fish did in fact read the gossip column and became paranoid that the police were already on to him. And so Fish wanted to take ownership of his crimes and take control of the story about the crime before the police did, but still didn't want to get caught. The stationery paper was just a mistake that led to Fish's arrest. He did not want to be caught himself, because in an institution like prison, he can't kill, he can't enact his fantasies, he can't take it, he loses control of his life, etc., all that. Also, probably he's still at his high point. He feels invincible. And Fish wanted to show the world, the Budd family, police, newspapers, all that he knew the truth, and specifically sent the letter to Grace's mother because of the personal connection he had with her, and took control by diverting the blame of Grace's death to her parents on several occasions by saying that he didn't kidnap Grace because Fish had permission, and that if they hadn't let Fish take Grace, Grace would still be alive. Fish diverts the blame from him to the parents, saying it was their own fault for not caring for their daughter, justifying his own crimes by blaming the victim, a common thing with serial killers. Also bragging about the crime, inflicting pain, all that. The letter is also an attempt to inflict pain on the Budd family and Mrs. Budd to satisfy his sexual or just sadistic fantasies. Fish's confession and cooperation with the police after his arrest was Fish's way of taking control of the situation and to demonstrate his power. In a letter Fish wrote to Detective King, he said, "You know as I that if I had not written that letter to Mrs. Budd, I would not be in jail. Had I not led you to the spot, no bones would have been found, and I could only be tried for kidnapping." Fish hired the best attorney he could find because he was desperate to avoid the death penalty. And so he hired James Dempsey, who hired several psychologists and psychiatrists to study Fish with the goal of finding evidence that Fish was legally insane and thereby being found not guilty by reason of insanity. So instead, Fish would just be committed to a mental hospital instead of going to prison and the electric chair. However, despite Fish's clear mental illness, proving his legal insanity would be a very difficult task. The prosecution's goal was to hold the same conclusion as Bellevue Hospital, that Fish was in fact legally sane, and hired their own team of psychiatrists as well to prove that Fish was in fact legally sane. And to prove that Fish did know the difference between right and wrong when he murdered Grace Budd. Of course, note at this time they only know of Grace Budd and not the other two confirmed murders. Yet. James Dempsey hired an alienist, which, if you don't know, is someone who studies mental illness at the time, basically a psychiatrist. They were called alienists because they believed that people who had mental illness were alienated from their own true nature and society. So that's what that means. Not someone who studies extraterrestrials and UFOs, and not someone who studies immigrants. Anywho, this alienist was named Dr. Frederick Wortham, who was a bit of a famous psychiatrist. And he spent the most time interviewing and studying Fish than any of the other psychiatrists from either the defense or the prosecution. Dr. Wortham, in addition to having interview sessions with Fish, looked into Fish's background and interviewed others who knew Fish and uncovered Fish's family history of mental illness. So if you'll remember, he had an uncle with hallucinations, along his mother also, and a few other people. Fish was very open when speaking with Dr. Wortham, and after Dr. Wortham finished his study of fish, he came up with the diagnosis of paranoid psychosis with a religious complex, and also stated that his sexual paraphilias originated from his experiences in the orphanage, and said he had never seen a case like Fish's ever before. Fish told Dr. Wortham about his crimes in great detail, along with his past as the orphanage and his delusions. He also confessed to his self-harm practices. In fact, when Fish confessed to sticking needles in his pelvic region so far he couldn't retrieve them, Fish wasn't believed until an x-ray revealed Fish's pelvic region showing up to 27 needles embedded in his body. As you can see, the x-ray is on the right at the bottom, right above the picture of Frederick Wortham. When asked about the needles and why Fish did these things, he said, quote, "There's just a mood that comes over me, and I just can't help myself." He also stated at a later time, "I had a message from Christ." So, as to why Fish would finally open up to Dr. Wortham in such great detail is probably because at this point Fish probably realized that his best option to avoid the death penalty was by the insanity plea, and by opening up to Dr. Wortham and telling him every little detail about his crimes, it would make him seem legally insane and may have been overstating some of his crimes to seem more insane, like his victim count, claiming he's raped 100+ children, at least one in every state, but at the same time, it's completely possible he did do that considering all the factors of the time period. Fish would have also been enjoying describing his crimes in detail by enjoying inflicting pain on those who heard about his crimes. He would also enjoy reveling in his crimes and talking about his crimes under his control. Given Fish's cautious and calculating behavior to avoid getting caught, it is unlikely that Fish was legally insane. When asked about the cannibalism, Fish said that he was obsessed with stories of cannibalism from his favorite book, the Edgar Allan Poe novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which has characters having to eat one another in order to survive. Fish also collected newspaper clippings about a German serial killer who killed over 20 boys or young men by biting through the throats of their victims, named Fritz Harriman, which I'm looking to possibly cover a little later on. He would also dismember the bodies and keeping the meat either for himself or to possibly sell on the black market. These is rumored. According to Fish, his intense interest in cannibalism started when he was a young boy, when his older brother, who was in the Navy, would tell stories about places in the Far East affected by famine where people had to eat human flesh and even sell off their own children to be eaten in order to survive. Fish claimed to have raped or have had children in every state, as he called it, and to have raped up to 100 young children, as we've previously mentioned. Dr. Wortham concluded that Fish's perception of reality was so skewed that Fish didn't know right from wrong. Yet it is highly likely that he was in fact legally sane and had complete awareness of his crimes. So here are some parts of Fish's confessions and interviews with Dr. Wortham. Quote, "I had sort of an idea through Abraham offering his son Isaac as a sacrifice. It always seemed to me that I had to offer a child for sacrifice. I had to purge myself of iniquities, sins, and abominations in the sight of God." He also said, "If it wasn't right, then an angel would have stopped me at the last moment. I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and to have pain inflicted on me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt me. The desire to inflict pain, that is all that is uppermost." Another strategy Dempsey used was using Fish's children as character witness to try and portray a positive picture of Fish And Fish's children described their father as a gentleman who didn't abuse them in any way. He didn't drink or smoke and was devoutly religious, just not in the way you think, and was a caring father. However, it's important to note that it's possible that since Fish's children were on the defense, they withheld details about Fish and simply didn't admit to any abuse or other behavior Fish exhibited, or were even in denial. Perhaps Fish never abused them and simply compartmentalized and separated his criminal life and father life. A common fact with most serial killers, they compartmentalize their two lives, which is how they're able to remain undetected for so long. In fact, most of what Fish's children said about Fish was at the trial, so that's really all we know. However, it's important that this is also just speculation. We really don't quite know. When pressed, Fish's children did admit to being aware of some of his odd behaviors, such as Fish's schizophrenia episodes, self-flagellation, and Fish's daughter had more positive descriptions of their father, while Fish's sons were a little less enthusiastic about Fish. In fact, Fish's eldest son, Albert Fish Jr., even said to reporters, quote, "The old skunk, I knew something like this would happen sooner or later. I want nothing to do with him, and I won't do anything to help him." After Albert Jr.'s comment, Fish wrote in a letter to his daughters, quote, "He is no son of mine. If you ever do anything else for me, I want you to do this. Do not ever call him brother again. Never allow him inside your home. Teach your little ones to despise him." Considering that Fish's preferred victims were boys, it is also possible that Fish abused his sons more than, or rather than, his daughters, given to how his daughters have a more positive view of him. It's also possible that his daughters were just simply in more denial or just simply didn't see. Plus, Albert Jr. lived with his father after Grace Budd's murder and saw his strange behavior. And that after Grace Budd's murder, that's when his compartmentalization kind of wears off and it just all blends into one life, as we saw with his escalation of behaviors. However, the full extent of abuse Fish subjected his children to, or how much Fish's children knew about his crimes and behavior, will never fully be known. A desperate attempt Fish also tried in order to gain sympathy from the jury and avoid the death penalty was by comparing Fish's crimes with how his wife Anna left him and his children. In the interviews he had with Dr. Worthing, he really emphasized this, and in a letter Fish wrote to one of his daughters, he claimed that he was the victim of his wife's mistreatment and believed that people would be more sympathetic to Fish once they learned about what Anna had done to him. Yet we know that although this might have been a stressful event that may have escalated his behaviors, he was assaulting children before his wife left him and even before he married, possibly. Anywho, Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 12, 1935, and James Dempsey's strategy was to prove Fish was legally insane by having Dr. Wortham testify about the things Fish confessed to. Dr. Wortham attempted to demonstrate Fish's irrational thinking to the court in his testimony, but Fish's confession and Dr. Wortham's testimony had details that were considered so shocking that women were actually let out of the courtroom before it began, and Dr. Wortham had to pause throughout his testimony to allow the remaining spectators and the jury to recover. However, despite Dr. Wortham's testimony, the prosecution had several psychiatrists who believed Fish was in fact legally sane. The doctors testified that Fish's disorders were not uncommon, as there were many people with sexual perversions, but not murderers, and said that Fish was fully aware of his actions, and Fish's mental condition did not impair his state of mind in terms of right versus wrong, which is really the foundation of an insanity plea. Right versus wrong in his state of mind, of knowing that. Dempsey also met surprising resistance when trying to bring up Fish's cannibalism in court because to Dempsey, the cannibalism would have been the most compelling piece of evidence to show Fish was out of touch with reality. However, when Dempsey tried to question Detective King about Fish's cannibalism on the stand, King said that Fish never confessed to cannibalizing Grace, and since cannibalism was only mentioned in the letter to Grace Budd, police never questioned Fish about the cannibalism, so Fish never admitted it. It's possible that police simply didn't want to believe that a seemingly gentle old man could have been capable of completing acts like criminal cannibalism, or they just simply didn't care as much. It's like, he killed him, let's book him, let's put him away, that type of mentality. Dr. Wortham was in fact the only one to ever testify about Fish's cannibalism. Here are some bits from Dr. Wortham's testimony, quote, "Now the experience in the orphanage was very important because he dates his earliest sexual abnormalities to this time. He described to me very vividly that in that place not only did the inmates commit all sorts of sensory acts with each other, in which he joined, but also it made the greatest impression on him. One of the guardians there, a sister or teacher, had the habit of frequently whipping the boys and taking 6 at a time and having them strip and one see what happened to the others, and he remembers very vividly seeing the other boys whipped, and he recalls before the age of 7 he had his first sexual feeling. He got that feeling from being whipped himself and seeing other boys whipped and screaming." You can really see that birth of sadomasochistic tendencies in Fish. He started his sexual career at age 17. At the time, he became a painter. Now, that profession of painter, this man has used as a convenience. He worked in many different institutions. He worked in any kind of home where there were children, where he thought he could get children. In these places, he made his headquarters the basement or the cellar. Now, this man has roamed around in basements and such for 50 years. There were so many innumerable instances that I can't begin to give you how many there are, but I believed to the best of my knowledge that he had raped 100 children at least, which, given the time period, is completely plausible. Fish's prime sexual interest has only been children from the age of about 5 to 14 or 16, and has no capacity of any kind for real feelings or any kind of mature person, including feelings of love or friendship. Kind of highlighting a bit of unempathetic traits and a little psychopathy. There's Fish with the Detective King in the courtroom. And there's I think maybe in a station. Sorry about that. Again, Fish with Detective King. This is Fish being escorted to and from the trial by 2 escorts. I'm kind of blurry. Here he's kind of, it appears, coughing or sneezing into a handkerchief, with, it appears, Detective King right behind him, holding his shoulder. And there's just a photo of Fish. You can really see the elderliness. Led up the stairs. By the way, I do want to kind of note that anyone who thinks that like a weakly old man or just someone who doesn't seem athletically fit is incapable of murder or strangulation, that has been proven wrong numerous times. And one of these times was Albert Fish. Another time was a Louisianan serial killer named Ronald Dominique, who had a heart condition and needed a cane to walk, yet he was able to strangle fully grown men. So it's really never just assume that someone's incapable of murder just because of their physical aesthetic, because that is absolutely a horrible thing to go off on. Here's a newspaper clipping for the arrest of Albert Fish, or maybe this is before. This might have been before when she was still missing. Bud's murder site yields more bones. So 30 are dug from under house. I'm not entirely sure if these are human bones or some of them are animal bones, or they're just 30 different Grace Bud bones or 30 different bones from different victims. It's all unknown, really. It's very possible he took other children to be murdered at Wisteria Cottage, but we don't know about them, and possibly never will, or they could just be animal bones or just 30 different Grace bones. Plea of insanity entered for Fish. Attorney for admitted slayer of Grace Budd asked for a decision. It was held to persons identified prisoner in court is connected with an island murder. That might have been the witnesses for Billy Gaffney. Fish's body holds 22 pieces of metal. X-ray shows needles of average size having been jabbed into prisoner's abdomen. Fish's confession is read to jurors. They also hear a letter by him saying he knew Bud's girl murder was wrong. 5 mistrial pleas denied. Defense objects to display of skull and bones. Defendant visited by 5. Yeah, that's right. The prosecution actually showed the skull of Grace Budd and some bones found at Wisteria Cottage to the jury. Fish's weird acts told by children. His devoted daughter weeps on stand. Son testifies he professed to be Christ. Prosecution rests case. Justice closed. Denies defense motion for a direct verdict of insanity. Can't really see how Dempsey's pushing on that insanity thing. Spoiler alert, Albert Fish loses plea. Court denies Bud Slayer's request for inquiry into sanity. So after Dr. Wortham's testimony on Fish's depraved thoughts and actions, the press had a public poll among themselves and unanimously decided that Fish was insane. However, the jury found Albert Fish guilty and legally sane. But when jurors were interviewed by reporters, one juror actually admitted that the jury believed Fish was in fact insane, but wanted Fish to receive the death penalty anyway. After Fish's was sentenced to death, he was questioned about other unsolved murders and cases of missing children. Police were able to strongly link Fish to being in the area of at least 14 other murders that were committed, and witnesses came forward with stories about Fish after seeing his face in the newspaper and remembering him as the man who attempted to abduct their child. The 2 crimes that Fish had most substantially been linked to were the murders of Francis McDonald and Billy Gaffney, as witnesses came forward after recognizing Fish in the papers, such as Anna McDonald, who saw Fish on the street where Francis was playing on the day of his disappearance, and the 2 trolley car workers who saw Fish with Billy Gaffney, of course, on the trolley car. At first, even with these witnesses, Fish denied these murders and any other crimes, but eventually confessed to the murders of Francis McDonald and Billy Gaffney in March 1935. Wait. When was the trial? Okay, so I'm guessing this was later March. Fish also confessed to stabbing 2 other people, one of them being Thomas Keaton. Fish's confession to the murder of Billy Gaffney from a letter to James Dempsey. Warning, this does detail the crime of Billy Gaffney and is very graphic in description. As I'm about to read it, caution is advised. Quote, I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked, and tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked up out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day at about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat of nine's tail, which is a whip or flagging device, homemade, short handle. Cut one of my belts in half, slit these half in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears, and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below the belly button. Then through his legs about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and legs below the knee. This I put in sacks weighed down with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into the pools of slimy water you will see all along the road going to North Beach. Water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank it once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best. His monkey and Pee-wee's had a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Then I slit the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and Pee-wee's, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put them in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when meat had roasted about 1/4 hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon, so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind did. I ate every bit of meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, and his Pee-wee's I could not chew. I threw them in the toilet. You can really see how he's wanting to inflict a lot of pain and disgust by his confession in great detail. Also, how he greatly details his cannibalism suggests that it was not his first time committing cannibalism, but it is his first recorded and confirmed time committing cannibalism. That is just terrible. And yet there are people getting tattoos of his face on their arm or leg, which kind of is disgusting. It's like almost getting a tattoo of Hitler. Anywho, Fish finally confessed to murdering Francis McDonald and Billy Gaffney because once Fish was on death row, he possibly felt like there was no point in denying to these murders anymore, especially when being pressed upon by a few witnesses. Plus, confessing to 2 or more murders allowed Fish to revel in his crimes and achieve one last thrill, and demonstrate how he knew the truth the whole time, and a last chance to be in control of anything in his life before he was executed, and in order to gain pleasure from the horror inflicted onto the people who heard about who would hear about the murders. Billy Gaffney's mother, Elizabeth Gaffney, visited Fish at Sing Sing prison, accompanied by Detective King and 2 other men, wanting to ask him about her son's death, and she was still unconvinced that Albert Fish was her son's killer. Accounts differ, either saying that Fish confessed to Billy's mother about the murder either face-to-face or by a letter from James Dempsey. Or Fish refused to speak to her, and Billy's mother gave up after 2 hours of asking him questions through his lawyer, James Dempsey. Go away. Police have estimated that in total, Fish sexually assaulted over 100 children, murdered between 9 and 15, and cannibalized 4, and is suspected in the murders of 5-year-old Emma Richardson, a white girl who went missing who either went missing or died on October 3rd, 1926. A 12-year-old girl named Eta Abramowitz, who was also white, in 1927 in the Bronx. She was found strangled and beaten on the roof of a 5-story apartment house at 10 and 13 Simpson Street. She died in a hospital soon after she was found. The murder escaped, but 20 detectives and many more policemen were hunting for a description was provided of a tall young man who was said to have tried to lure several young girls to the neighborhood into dark hallways and alleys on May 14th, 1927. So with that description, kind of makes it less likely to be Albert Fish, but he is still a suspect. A 4-year-old boy named Emil Albing on July 13th, 1930. A 6-year-old Asian girl named Robin Jan Liu on May 2nd, 1931. A 16-year-old girl, Mary Ellen O'Connor, on February 15th, 1932, in Fair Rockaway in Queens. Her mutilated body was found in the woods close to a house that Fish had been painting at the time. A 17-year-old boy, Benjamin Collins, on December 15th, 1932. However, the full extent of Fish's crimes will likely never be known, unless we can time travel or something, or resurrect the dead. Albert Fish was executed by the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York on January 13th, 1936, at the age of 65 years old, and was pronounced dead at 11:09 p.m. It's reported that his last words were, quote, "I don't even know why I'm here." Fish is said to have held the electrocutioner positioned the electrodes on his body. According to one witness present, it took 2 joules before Fish died, creating a rumor that the apparatus was short-circuited by the needles Fish had inserted into his body, but this rumor was proven false. After Fish's execution, James Dempsey told reporters that he had Fish's final statement, which was several pages of handwritten notes that Fish had apparently penned and written in the hours before his execution. However, James Dempsey refused to share the statement, saying, quote, "I will never show to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities I had ever read." Fish's body was buried at Sing Sing Cemetery. This, although seems like an execution photo of Albert Fish being strapped into the electric chair, is actually a fake one, from the original being this. You can kind of see, if you can recognize Albert Fish's face has been kind of like pasted in from his mugshot, which you saw earlier when on the slide that talked about his arrest. But no, it is actually a black man being strapped into the executioner chair. Some more newspaper clippings. Police try to link Bud Girl Slayer to 3 other crimes. Fish question on O'Connor, Collins, and Gaffney cases. He denied part in them. Westchester to try him. Transfer of prisoner to that County now pending. Child skeleton is unearthed. Fish says he slew the Gaffney boy. Penitentiary 8 skeptical of story after alleged written confession. Lapses in details scored. Grace Butts killer says he took Brooklyn child to Riker dumps to murder him. Slayer of Bud Girl dies in electric chair. Fish 65 pays penalty at Sing Sing. Bronx Negro is also put to death. Who knows, maybe that was the other photo that was photoshopped from. Here's another photo of Albert Fish. Fish faces death in chair tonight as supreme thrill. Alright, that concludes the story of Albert Fish. I hope you join me next time as we finish off Volume 2 with the biographies on the Morse murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who killed 5 children in the 1960s. Thank you for joining me. Like and subscribe and all that fun jazz. Comment, leave any things in the comments, such as any biographies you want covered. I am looking for new material. Thank you. I hope to see you next time. I have been your narrator, Porter Hymas. Thank you and goodbye.